Hi, everyone. Harry here to talk about everyone's most fascinating justice in the wake of the Supreme Court term, Amy Coney Barrett. So we've got a whole flurry of articles about her. There were instances, really high-profile instances, where she separated from the other five and at least took some baby steps toward the liberal three, and sort of what's going on as she emerging as a different, new, independent voice in the court. So you'll see everywhere in the major press the Amy Coney Barrett story. So I thought we would do ours. First, here's my general take on her and the court. I've made my discontent and criticism of the court pretty clear, and it has a lot to do with the lockstep conservative six and all the kinds of ways in which that really stifles the court's functions and really puts them out of step with the American people. But it's a complicated issue, the relationship between the court's views and the people's views, and the court does serve as this counter-majoritarian check, etc. And I don't think it's simply because they're conservative, that makes them so objectionable. Rather, I see especially the five as being kind of having their own identification, all having been bred and come of age at a time in the late 80s and 90s when conservative thought was really becoming bolder and more aggressive and justifiably, in a sense, reacting to what had been real sort of liberal hegemony in the courts and especially the law schools. So it had been, a dirty word to be a conservative until around then. And with it's basically 1986 is the ancient history here. The Federalist Society is formed, and there's a whole very sort of conscious agenda. At that time, John Roberts is an official in the Department of Justice. I overlapped with him a little and saw him operate. I'm here to tell you his basic instincts are rock-rib conservative. And in the same way, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch clerked for Kennedy. I'm friendly with, or had been until I've, so parted company with them and knew Thomas and Alito. And my real objection is that I think they are not simply conservative, but kind of bred in the same hothouse of a particular movement, and they are movement conservatives of a certain epoch or a certain time in American legal thought, and their loyalty lies there. And so I think when you put that all together, it really makes for a court that is lax, especially with sometimes Roberts will take note of his role, but lacks the sort of maturity and broad vision that, the Supreme Court needs to have. It's that as much as they're being kind of card-carrying members of a particular conservative movement. Amy Coney Barrett is not that, and that's really distinctive. She's a solid conservative, but she comes through a kind of an intellectual religious tradition among others. She taught it at Notre Dame and is herself famously, an amazing kind of person in life, 9 kids and couple adopted, and very, very, her Catholic faith, a very big part of her life. And I think that is the intellectual wellspring of her conservatism more than it is this sort of almost frattish Federalist Society 80s and 90s culture to which I think the other five, even Roberts, when the chips are down, have allegiance. So to me, that's what makes her already distinctive and independent. Now, has she been evolving, or is she now on her way to? There's a sort of freak out factor in some of these stories. A really nasty little aside by a professor at Houston saying that Elena Kagan is lacquering her with her own, with different layers, and really sort of, taking her under her wing. And, conservatives are up in arms about this, or worried at least. I don't see that. So what I think the daylight between her and the conservatives, I think this term is more than anything a sign of the conservatives, and especially Roberts and Kavanaugh, having themselves moved right, as they do when the chips are down, and the chips are down among other times, it seems to me, and I'm sad to say, when the sort of political fortunes of the Republican Party seem most in play. And the immunity case, a case in point, it's just an atrocity from the soup to nuts, and gives a cloak of protection to Donald Trump that, absolutely warps the law and the constitutional structure. Anyway, so I see Barrett as not beholden in the same way to the same kind of movement, and that makes her principled. So I think she's more. She's interesting, and I think very intelligent, nuanced, etc. And that's the difference. It could be in individual cases. She's certainly unafraid of casting in with the libs in certain cases, but I don't think she's going to be as the conservatives say, are afraid out there, a Justice Blackmun type who more and more evolves, to use the dirty word that conservatives use. But several cases in point that, again, really show her to the left, if you want to use that kind of spectrum, in important cases. So the immunity case itself, 5-4 without her, and you can imagine that maybe there would have been efforts to have some of the libs join her and coalesce in a different way, but Roberts and Kavanaugh stood firm. But her point was no small point. She basically said, all right, the president has immunity, but why does that mean you can't even introduce evidence of official action? What does that have to do with the basic notion of needing a president to be vigorous and aggressive? Fine. But the notion that, like, an official action become evidence in a proceeding down the line, what's the problem there? And it is an incredible hamstring on exactly these prosecutions, and maybe the New York one as well, that you can never actually introduce as evidence. An official action is really over the top and a wide span, and she's very sensible in parting company there. In the Fisher case, that's the one involving obstruction and the January 6th offenders. Basically, the court can, and this is one of the articles of faith, my main truck here and brief with the court is they have a kind of agenda that was formed in the hothouse of Federalist Society and other culture in the late 80s. So they really like to cut back and have yet to meet, it seems, a white-collar case that they don't want to cut back on. But so they said here that the obstruction really required a specific piece of evidence that you're actually obstructing, not just in general. But Barrett was really, straightforward, and they had to have a tortured reading of that, and a lot of it had to do with their policy predilections, which they have in white-collar cases, of not being a trap for the unwary white-collar defendant or even, an obstruction defendant. And she said, look, it's true, Congress might have thought of this, but it's pretty well established, including in canonical conservative thought, that we apply what they said. And look what they said, and guess what? It doesn't say what the majority says it says. And that was, solid, unafraid, joins the libs, etc. And then finally, my own personal favorite was the Raheny gun case, where they had to depart from their previous precedent and say somebody with a domestic violence adjudication can be barred from having a gun. And she had this really interesting, and she did this at her confirmation hearings as well, discussion about a very important nuanced concept about level of generality, and just to surface it quickly, when you do the court's much-loved history and tradition test for any kind of unenumerated right, how do you describe the right in question? So, for same-sex marriage, do you call the right in question the right of homosexuals to marry, in which case you're not going to get a lot of evidence of back in the 1790s of protection? Or do you call it, the right of people to choose a life partner or marriage in general, in which case you will? And that initial choice is very important. She recognizes it, and whereas others on the court, in kind of lockstep with Justice Scalia from way back when, say, with no good reason, let's just choose the most narrow possible, which really stacks the deck against the right. She says, no, it's a hard one, but you really got to choose the right, appropriate one. And that's essentially what Roberts did, even though he didn't acknowledge it as such when he said, was there relevantly similar restrictions in history, not restrictions of domestic violent offenders, because we didn't have those, we didn't have that cause of action, but relevantly similar, and there it meant people who were shown to be violent. So that she was very thoughtful, and again, very independent there on her own. So a summary on Amy Coney Barrett. She is, everyone's focus now, intense interest and intense anxiety, I would say, among conservatives, and some, efforts, I think, to shape her within the papers and media as much as you can do it. But someone who I think of as in stark contrast to the other five who are movement conservatives, really very, very anchored in conservative legal thought, but also faith. Not to say she applies, religious principles or violates the Constitution, but her intellectual heritage is of a different sort and very connected, I think, to her faith. And it showed in several different cases this term, although bottom line, I don't see her as having moved significantly left. She'll always be an interesting possibility in cases coming up, but I don't think we'll see her as someone who moves significantly left. Rather, she's an illustration of how rock rib, hard right the other five, yes, including Chief Justice John Roberts, are in the most sort of charged and especially political cases that the Supreme Court takes on. Talk to you later.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.